Welcome everybody, greetings on SG Silva Rerum. My name is Simon Gornovich, and I try to popularize the history, sociology, art, aesthetics, antiques, and all the things that are very interesting for, and trying to popularize a knowledge which is so powerful and can give us the great opportunity to know more and understand more. Nice to see you English speakers from all over the world. And today we will speak about Operation Barbarossa, which were actually the greatest campaign in the history of wars, uh, made by the human in the 1941 and 22nd June 1941. I will start my speech and use a great book, wrote it about 40 years ago, 2,194 Days of War, an illustrated chronology of the Second World War, compiled by Cesare Salmaggi and Alfredo Palavicini. Very good, stylish book that will give us a calendarium, a chronological order of all war from the 1939 to 1945. But today we will concentrate on the first days of campaign of Operation Barbarossa. Adolf Hitler were preparing to this campaign for actually tens of years. First time when he was invited to the University of München of Monachium, where he met a very famous Professor General Karl Haushofer. He suddenly discovered, after few speeches of the Karl Haushofer, that the real future of the geopolitical and strategical purposes of German army, of Germany of the future, would be to invade and spread all over on the east, right? Especially on the Russia. Because when they analyze everything what happened on the west, they realize that on the better and on the true way to spread the borders, to spread all territory of the German Reich will be possible when they will conquer the east, the Russia. Welcome everybody on my channel. I see you are making subscriptions. You are greetings to everybody, right? So all the war that was started in 1939 in Europe, because actually the Second World War already started, some of the historians says it in 1931, at least 1937, of the war between China and Japan, right? On the 7th July of the 1937, there was a small battle between two small groups of soldiers near the Marco Polo Bridge. But we'll concentrate on everything what's happening, most important reasons related to the European theater of war. So we have a war in Poland, the war in the West, seizing Norway, dominating and seizing Denmark, dominating neutral countries. Only the Great Britain stand alive, we can say. And on the east, we have a awesome Soviet Union, which was actually an allies of the Germans, right? This story weren't described properly for tens of years, even on the West, where the historians try to not to speak too openly about relations between Germans and Soviets, which were described as some kind of armistice, not a proper alliance, but it was a proper alliance. The British RAF have even the plans to bombard Baku on the Caucasus, right? There's a theory saying that MI6 was involved in killing of the Polish officers from the Soviet Pole camps. but this is on a theory, of course. We haven't got a proper proof, but we can realize that in that time, the Great Britain was very frustrated and paralyzed by thinking that Germans really can win the war and can dominate all the Europe theater of war. So it's quite possible they were trying by the intelligence to make weaker how it's only possible every possible allies, especially Soviet Union, which were a great ally for the Germany. In our point of view, we always think that the Russians always fight with Germans, but this is not true. Even when the Battle of Britain were going on, and hundreds of airplanes were shot down over the Britain, the British meteorological ships helped on the North Sea to give a proper informations about the weather over the Great Britain to the Germans, right? So that realize how this treaty between Joachim Ribbentrop and Joseph Stalin, actually Vyacheslav Molotov, was real, and it occurred concrete and solid specifications for war effort. But let's concentrate on this great book. What we have, we will continue our speech, our conversation in relation for every day what's happening exactly from the 22nd June 1941 in the Europe. 4:15 a.m. East European time. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, is launched as long ago as 21st July 1940. Hitler had ordered his generals to prepare a plan of attack against the USSR. A similar directive, number 21, was issued by the Führer on 18th December of the same year, the operation called cryptonym Otto. The plan had twice been revised. In its original form, it was based on two main offensives against Moscow and against Kiev, with a covering action in the north towards Leningrad. The second version still had Moscow as its main objective, but also provided for an advance into Ukraine by forces based in Romania, and for a more massive thrust towards Leningrad. According to the final plan, the strongest thrust will be towards Leningrad, with simultaneous pressure on Smolensk and Moscow. The Russians are completely taken by surprise by the assault. The Germans has managed to assemble their enormous army without their enemy ever recognizing the extreme danger of this situation, which was not true because they recognize actually what's happening, and we still have not improper information about what Soviets were thinking, what Soviets were doing properly, and that's why we will try to speak about that in this movie. The success of the invading forces, who reckon on completing their campaign before the winter, is overwhelming. The Germans break through almost all along the line, which was true. The Führer has set up his headquarters, known as the Wolfschanze, which is the Wolf's Den, in East Prussia, in a forest near Rastenburg. The German troops completely overwhelmed the Russians in every sector except the south, where dogged resistance limits their advance. Not only are the Russians short of motor vehicles for rapid movement, but they are positioned not along the border, which is a new border and only lightly fortified, but in depth of echelons anything from 65 to 325 miles deep. The German attack should not have been unexpected. The Russians secret against Richard Sorge, who operated in Japan, has already reported, is specifying the forces which will be employed as early as 19th of May, and on 15 June he actually notified its precise date. Confirmation of surrogate information had some on 18th June from a German deserter who had crossed to the Russians to escape court martial. That was true. That was a German communist, and Stalin involved. That he is a saboteur. He make a sabotage, a subversion. So they shot him. But Stalin and Molotov convinced the Germans were neither able or willing to relinquish their operation against the British, gave no credence to the informants. That's what Stalin was thinking. He read the Mein Kampf book, and he was convinced that Hitler will never start a war on the two fronts, which was logical from his point of view. That makes really a great sense, but he didn't realize it can really happen. At 11:15 a.m., Molotov announces the German attack to the Russian people at 4 o'clock this morning, with no declaration of war and no demands made on the Soviet Union. German troops have assailed our country, attacked our frontier at many positions and bombs Zhytomyr, Kiev, Sebastopol, Kaunas, and other places. Similar attacks by bombers and artillery have also been launched from Romanian and Finnish territory. This incredible attack on our country is an act of treachery unquilled in the history of civilized nations, and that's true, that the scale was really awesome. It has been carried out despite the existence of non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Germany. That was not only a non-aggression pact, this is how the history looks like for the years. That is a full-scale alliance between the Germans and Russians. That wasn't on a non-aggression pact. And although the German government has never had the least case for complaint about the way in which the Soviet Union has fulfilled its own obligations, the entire responsibility for this act of rapine must therefore fall on the Nazi rulers. The government of the Soviet Union is deeply convinced that the whole population of our country will do its duty. The government appeals to you, men and women, citizens of the Soviet Union, to unite more closely and ever around the glorious Bolshevist party. The Soviet government and our great leader, Comrade Stalin, our case is just the enemy will be defeated. Victory will be ours. Stalin does not speak to the people himself until 11 days later on 3rd of July, which was related with his attitude, and he felt really depressed with everything what happened, especially for losing the city of Minsk, which was a very important city of Belarusian Soviet Republic. The Supreme Defense Council, the Stavka, is set up urgently, and 15 million men are called up. Italy and Romania declare war on the USSR. You see, this point of view, it shows typical historian's view, like the Russians never concentrate and mobilize forces for any war. Yeah? This description is quite false, and many people on the West doesn't realize how false is it. The USSR create the biggest weaponry that nobody can even imagine that time, before and after actually. With all these resources, where this country will have only 1 million workers in the industry in the 1914, with millions of the workers, with 10% production of every possible material things all over the world, with taking about 70 to 80% of the budget to create a massive war effort, to create over 25,000 tanks, 200 submarines, over 10,000 war airplanes. This country wasn't preparing to any defense and wasn't attacked unprepared. It was unprepared to the defense, but there are pretty many arguments showing that they were preparing for the offensive action, right? In London at 9:00 p.m., Winston Churchill declares, "Any state who fights Nazis will have our side." North Africa General Wavell is informed by his government of their decisions to relieve him of his duties as Commander-in-Chief of British Middle East Forces and send him to India as Commander-in-Chief of British Forces there. The word Middle East loses a great protagonist. So we see on the first day, and this is most incredible, that in that time they didn't show the proper truth about what's really happening. And many German soldiers, the allies of the Axis soldiers, accept this fact. They found many trucks, not in camouflage, not in the fortresses, many NKVD units, many black divisions were related with the prisoners of the camps in the far east, right? The bridges were not mined. The Germans even find a small pamphlet, small books, how the Russians should speak to the Germans on the German territory, right? They don't find a maps of the Soviet Union in the Soviet units. They have a maps of the Prussia, for example. So what's the point to have a Prussian maps when you are expecting a possible attack on the border, right? There are also counter-arguments saying that the defense line of the Soviets didn't look like they were mobilizing for the offensive. But we must remember they were preparing for that. So the 22nd June, it's a very important date in history of the Second World War. It realized me in the long years of study that the Germans just went forward before the Russians. They were preparing their own war against the Germany. If we take a look and examine all kinds of weaponry that they were eligible to use in the Soviet Union, Germans even haven't got a 10% of this quality and these purposes like the Russians have. Just a heavy tank KV-1, the paratroopers in great number, the massive heavy artillery used, for example, in Finland, the massive air forces. For example, in this book, if we speak about Russian forces and their positions, this book say the Russian force was the equivalent of 158 divisions, which is not true, which is completely not true. There were at least 300 divisions on the first line in the 1941 22nd June, when we don't speak about the reserves, right? All this false information is going from the Soviet resources, which were trying to lie Westerns about a complexity of the Soviet army, about the Red Army wasn't prepared for any kind of war, but they were preparing for almost over, actually 20 years, for the massive operations against the Westerns. Only the tank BT-7, which were not known about the Westerns, means Bystrochodny tank, means fast tank. It was prepared for Autobahn, the Germans' railway, the Germans' fast ways for cars. They can go even about 107 kilometers per hour. So you haven't got such ways in the Soviet Union. You have them only in Germany. So this is another kind of argument that we realize that they were really preparing for offensive on the West. Of course, after when the Russians almost were defeated, after the war, they changed all the stories and start to make a propaganda version that they were never prepared for any occasion to attack the Germans. But what they can say after so awesome loss they got in the first months of 1941, from the June 1941. However, at the time of the invasion, only 2,500,000 men were actually manning the Western Front, which is not true. There were much more, at least 2,900,000, but we have the information that can be absolutely more than 4 million. The air forces had 1,350 bombers, which is not true. There were thousands of bombers, only 500 of them of modern design. And this is typical for Soviet propaganda, just saying only 500 in modern design, which have no influence because many other kind of bombers and fighters were really quite effective even in that stage of war and were eligible to can be used against Germans. 2,000 fighters nearly and inferior to the German fighters, and about 800 obsolete reconnaissance aircraft. The line from the Baltic to the Black Sea was divided into 5 fronts, later reduced to 3 and put under the command of Voroshilov, Timoshenko, and Budionny. At the time of German attack, the forces were drawn up as follows. So that's all the fronts are described. But what's the point? Take a look at the way, like they say, from official documents, it appears there were in service 867 T-34 and 508 KV-1 tanks of 28 tons and 43.5 tons respectively, armed with an excellent 76.2 millimeter gun, plus 2 of 3 7.6 millimeter machine guns and heavily armored. In theory, these tanks were superior to the heavy Panzerkampfwagen IV tanks that the Germans were equipped with, both numerically and performance, but the practice, this superiority was cancelled out by the Russian commanders' mistake, strategic conception, the proper employment of armor. Panzerkampfwagen IV never was a heavy tank. That was the heaviest tank in the Panzerwaffe in German Wehrmacht, but never have a status of the heavy tank. The only one army in the world that had a heavy tank was the Soviet Union with KV-1. And even in that text, it doesn't say exactly it was a heavy tank. This is the way, like we can speak about something and doesn't say properly what really is. The fact that it was only 867 T-34 and 500 KV doesn't mean that the Soviets haven't got any resources to attack. They have a massive resources to attack. They have a massive artillery pieces. They have at least 18,000 tanks to use. Even if they were projected and engineered in the late 30s, it doesn't mean that they were useless. They were better than Czech LT-38 and much better than LT-35, and better even than Panzerkampfwagen 3E, like Edmund, and most of them better than Panzerkampfwagen 4 with short guns, right? The first longer guns, the version F2, it was provided in 1942, very, very late. So the KV, only this 500 KV, and this book doesn't say that openly, was a massive weaponry against any kind, any sort, any type of the army in the world. You can check that. This information are not false. They are completely recognizable, and there is no any reason to somehow minimize it and say it's not true. The Russians have a powerful army. They spent all fruits of the communism to create such amazing and absolutely unstoppable weaponry. Let's have a look on the 23rd of June what happened. Eastern Front, the Germans make spectacular progress in Army Group North sector. The 56th Armored Corps, General Manstein of the 4th Panzergruppe Heppner, has crossed the important Ariogala viaduct over the river Diabusia in Latvia, 50 miles from the starting point. In the central sector, Guderian tanks, the 24th Armored Corps, General von Schweppenburg and 47th Armored Corps General Lemelsen have stormed across the River Bug, above the beloved Brest-Litovsk, and consolidated at Kobryń and Prużane, 40 and 45 miles from the frontier, while those of General Hoth, 62nd Armored Corps General Kuntzen, and 39 Armored Corps General Schmidt have captured Merech and Alytus, taking the bridges on the Niemen intact after an advance of 55 miles. In the southern sector, south of the river Pripyat, Kleist Erste Panzergruppe had made more modest progress. There is a strong concentration of Russian troops, 56 divisions, including 16 armored divisions. It's about 16 armored corps, but the equivalent about one division. It's something like one corps, one division on their front. So you see, even this book said so many divisions of army, but it didn't say in numbers. So somebody who is reading that, he has no imagination what really powerful was the Soviet army. The Luftwaffe continues to inflict tremendous damage of the enemy. 1,200 aircraft are destroyed on the ground or in combat before noon on 22nd June, which is not, it was given this information by General Franz Halder, but in that our time, they are not completely sure. There are even studies saying about 10 times lower number, 120. Chaos reigns in the headquarters of the Russian formations, not held by directives from the general staff, non-removal of complete ignorance of the facts of the situation, such as one sent to the headquarters of the Southwestern Front, ordering the forces there to launch a major offensive and retake Lublin, 30 miles behind the enemy lines within 24 hours. So we see the Russians are not even with this information, not prepared for any kind of deep concentration to defend. They are more concentrated to make an offensive action, even in that situation. And everybody who can analyze such texts can recognize that the Russians were more interested to make an offensive than to pull back. This is interesting info, even in that book. North Africa, Italian and German air raids on the fortress of Tobruk continue, but without appreciable effect. Italy, British air raid on Syracuse. That all the information what happened that day. Let's have a look on another day. 24th of June, Eastern Front. In the northern sector of the Russians launch a violent counterattack. North Africa, British bomber squadrons attack Benghazi and Tripoli overnight. Slovakia declares war on the USSR. Recruitment of voluntary force service against the Soviet Union starts in Spain and Denmark. So we have a feeling that whole Europe start to fight against the Soviet Union, which is not true. These legions and forces were minimal. That was battalions, eventualis, divisions. The divisions of Slovakian army were very weak. The Italian army also the same. What Italians can do, that was really strange experience, to send Italian Armada in Russia to Soviet Union. That was really strange experience. And Hitler actually doesn't want Italians there because he saw how they are fighting and the morale were very weak. And the standards of the Italian army was completely not appreciate for such operations, especially, which was very important to size the Soviet Union. So they started about the 30th of June, but Hitler wasn't happy with that idea at all. The experience showed that Italians can't make such operations. The economy, morale of the army, and all attitude to the normal, ordinary Italian soldier were not appreciable, not compatible with expectations that they really were visible. All right, so we will maybe end about on the stage, and we will continue later on in English language. I hope there was somebody who is an English speaker and he will be satisfied to speak about it in that language. Please for comments under below the movie after the live transmission broadcast will end. And regards to you, fellows, guys, and see you next time, and we will continue in other occasion. See you. Greetings to everybody. See you, guys.